Hello, so today for my coffee and conservation talk, I'll be discussing about beach wrack, the coastline compost. And by the end, you'll see how a rotten pile of seaweed makes a huge difference on the coastal beach habitats. So first of all, what is seaweed? Well, it's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's not even a fungus. It's actually a protist. This means it belongs to a group called Protista and it's actually more closely related to mold and algae. Now, even though seaweed is full synthetic, it actually lacks plant anatomy. So let's start on the bottom. What we have here are roots. It's actually something called a holdfast. Unlike plants on land, the seaweed doesn't need a cell wall or a stem to grow up because it's surrounded by water. So instead of a stem, we actually have a stipe. And the stipe has tiny little balloons attached to them called gas bladders, which help bring the seaweed closer to the surface. And finally, what we have here are not leaves. These are actually blades, and they help convert the sunlight for food for the plants, for the seaweeds. And the frond is just a way to describe both the stipe and blade structures together. So now that we know what seaweed is, what is wrack? Well, the seaweed doesn't stay on the ocean floor forever. It will eventually detach, and sometimes it can wash up on shore and get tangled up with all sorts of beach materials, such as carrion and debris. So first we have the main part of wrack, which is decomposing seaweeds. So as it decomposes, it breaks down by the microbes. And speaking of decomposition, we also have carrion, which is actually another name for dead animals. So I do wrack monitoring surveys with UCI, and sometimes when my team and I would go through a wrack pile, we would see all sorts of critters such as crabs, mussels, and there were a few occasions where we did see dead birds. And finally, we got debris, and it could come in two types. First, we have natural debris. So sometimes more inland materials can get tangled up inside the piles. These can include feathers, twigs, or leaves. And then you have your more human-made debris, in other words, trash, such as candy wrappers or bottle caps. Now, within the coastal beach habitat, beach wrack is classified as a microhabitat, which means it has key distinguishing features that support a wide variety of life within the coastal beach habitats. And these can be presented in the next slide. Okay, so there's microhabitat, and within the next slide, we can see these three main functions. First, we have nutrient cycling and food, then we have shelter, and then we have a species nursery. For food and shelter, if you notice on the beach, there's limited plant growth, but wrack serves as an alternative source for food and shelter. The decomposing seaweed attracts all sorts of insects, such as beach hoppers, flies, and beetles. And when you get the insects all in one place, this actually provides a food source or a buffet for shorebirds, such as the western snowy plover. Then you have shelter. Sometimes some of the flies will lay their eggs inside a beach wrack, and then the shorebirds will pluck off tiny pieces to add on their nest. And finally, you have the wrack releasing nitrogen to the environment. And why would nitrogen be important? Because when you release nitrogen, you actually feed the microbial and planktonic communities, which is the main basis and the starting point for the marine food web. In other words, by ensuring that the microbes and plankton is fed, you ensure the food source for all sorts of species, such as sharks, seals, sea lions, fish, and birds. So on the next slide, we can actually see one of the food webs that benefits from wrack. As you can see here, we have wrack on the bottom, and it can support the food web in several ways. First, it could be directly consumed by the consumer, such as this beach hopper. And then when you feed the beach hopper, you could feed other species. This can include terrestrial carnivores, shorebirds, and carnivorous insects. And even if the beach wrack's not directly eaten by the consumer, it could still be broken down by particulate matter. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it releases nitrogen back into the environment, but it could actually feed deposit feeders as well, such as the smoke crab. And again, you secure another food source for the shorebirds. Now let's take a moment and imagine what happens if beach wrack is completely taken out of the equation. So on the next slide, we have beach wrack arrays. Now this is up for open discussion. What would happen if beach wrack is taken out of this food web?
I'm going to go ahead and answer just by talking. I'm guessing that this whole system would collapse.
Exactly. So without a beach wrack, you don't have the main food source for the consumers in particulate matter, and just have cascading effects. And any other responses? Possible answers can also include maybe declines in populations, or yeah, that's also another good another good response. The food chain would probably not exist, or it would actually dwindle, because if you can't feed everyone, then not everyone's going to survive or have enough food sources or energy. So yeah, these are all really good responses, and we can actually see the impacts on the next slide. Beach grooming is a practice that usually involves having heavy machinery plow through the beach to collect contaminants and organic materials. This is usually done to secure human health, but also a main contributing factor is to improve beach aesthetic. And through mechanical grooming, you actually have cascading effects on the coastal beach habitat. Some impacts can include shorebird decline and more vulnerable coastlines. Luckily, on the next slide, we actually have some management to help regulate beach grooming practices. For example, in Newport, California, there are snowy plovers at the bubble appeared to the wedge. As a result, there's no mechanical grooming because snowy plovers are a listed species. There is some hand grooming present, but it's not as impactful or harmful as mechanical grooming. Then you have Crystal Cove State Park, which is in the neighboring area. There's no mechanical grooming at all, and it actually serves an ideal site for Wrack research. Each month, my team and I would go to Crystal Cove State Park and study several samples of Wrack piles for our monthly survey. And as you can see on the image on the right, we have a bird's eye view, and the tiny dots are likely the Wrack piles. So speaking of research and fieldwork, the next slide features a key component in our study, having a beach Wrack field guide. So this is a general list of certain species or items that can be found in Wrack. So on the left, we have sea plants and seaweeds, and the ones that are in bold will be discussed later on throughout the slides. Then we have other. So these are our non-plant or seaweed materials. This can include trash, terrestrial material, driftwood, shells, barnacles, carrion, mulch, and oil patties. And last year, the previous beach Wrack research team did record higher amounts of oil due to the Huntington Beach oil spill incidents. So this is also another reason why we would study beach Wrack. It serves as a kelp forest indicator. So a kelp forest is an underwater habitat, which means it would take a lot of resources to study it in person. You would probably need a diver's license. You would probably need to get waterproof equipment. Luckily, beach Wrack serves as an alternative source because the seaweed that grows in the kelp forest can wash on shore, and we can make certain inferences or conclusions based on the type of seaweed that washes on shore. This also brings up all sorts of questions. For example, what species are present and dominant, and should we be concerned about invasive seaweeds? First, we have seagrass. This is one of the most dominant Wrack species, and there's two types. This includes the eelgrass or Zostera and the surfgrass or Bilospidatics. Unlike seaweed and kelp, this is actually a true plant. It has perennial and flowering properties, and there is a root system present. Next, we have giant kelp. So this is another dominant species. The scientific name for it is Macrocystis pyrifera. It's classified as a brown algae. Usually a holdfast would be present, but sometimes it can wash up as fragmented or parts. Luckily, we do have key features to help identify it from the rest of the rock pile. This includes the round stipe, alternating branches, and as you can see on the image here, we have one blade per gas bladder. So there's one blade attached closely to the gas bladder for the giant kelp. Next, we have red algae, also known as Rhytophyta. It's actually one of the oldest types of multicellular algae, and this is personally my favorite seaweed species because I really enjoy the magenta to purple hues. But you have to be careful when trying to ID it through coloration because over time it can lose its color and become bleached. Also, I like to point out that unlike your typical structure of seaweed, it has more of a moss-like appearance. And then finally, we have our two invasive species, the sargassums. On our left, we have Sargassum horneri, and its key features are the tiny seed or rice-shaped gas bladders. And on our right, we have Sargassum muticum, which has more circular-shaped gas bladders. So both of these species are native to Orange County, California. They were actually from the West Pacific, ranging from northern Japan to the Philippines. And they were hypothesized to have been brought in through different occasions. Sargassum muticum was likely introduced first back in the early 1900s or mid 1900s due to oyster trading with Japan. And Sargassum horneri was recently discovered in the early 2000s. It was thought to have been brought in through recreational boating. And why do we want to be aware of these species? Well, on the next slide, we can see that sargassum can become a problem because it can outcompete the native species and spread. Since it's in a new environment, it doesn't have as much competition or predators in comparison to its original environment. And when you have the same type of, and then as you can see here on this image, you have the same type of sargassum colonizing the area over and over. You don't see that much diversity. There's no giant kelp, there's no red algae, there's no seagrass, and there's no other species such as feather boa or sea palm. Luckily, Wrack can be used to monitor and track how much of the sargassum is accumulating, and also can lead to other findings, such as if there's seasonal variation or if there's certain zones that get more sargassum than others. And this is just a quick photo to show how sargassum actually looks like during a Wrack survey. As you can see, it gets more dried out, but the gas bladders can be used as a good indication to separate the sargassum horneri from the sargassum medicum. Speaking of distinguishing one species from another, we're going to play a little game. It's a bit of a Wrack ID game, and it's actually kind of reflective of what my team and I would do on a monthly basis. So as you can see here, this is a normal Wrack pile. You're going to try to ID the species in here, and just as a heads up, the only species that will be ID include the ones we previously mentioned. This includes the seagrass, giant kelp, red algae, sargassum horneri, and sargassum medicum. But there will be other non-plants and non-seaweed materials, such as driftwood and trash. Yes, that's a really good response. We actually have giant kelp present, and yeah, seagrass. Any other non-plant materials or non-seaweed materials in here? Yeah, a twig, or also terrestrial material, and that actually goes through our current list. So if you see on the next slide, these are our main 3 items in this Wrack pile. Now the next one's going to be a little tricky. So if you see on the next slide, we actually have more items tangled up in here, and that's part of our survey. Sometimes some of the piles would be so tangled up, we would have to use our guide and try to pinpoint distinguishing features to separate one species from another. So feel free to give, yeah, we actually have red algae in that in that left corner. Luckily, it wasn't too desiccated, so it's able to stand out from the rest of the Wrack pile. And yes, we also have seagrass. Also, just as a hint, we do have one of the sargassum species in here. So let's see if you guys could try to find it. And just as another hint, does that piece of paper look like it belongs here? Okay, so thank you for the responses. As you can see on the next slide, we have more items present in this Wrack pile. We have the red algae, and on the left corner, we actually have the sargassum horneri. We have seagrass, terrestrial material, wood, and also trash present. So why should we care, and how does Wrack impact us? Well, it can impact us through several ways. First, we have the sand dune formation on the next slide. Wrack can collect and trap sand, which helps make sand dunes for the coastal beach habitat. This kind of serves under the umbrella of the shelter function. And for the sand dunes, we provide additional protection from storms and wave activities. However, beach grooming flattens the shoreline. Not only does it get rid of the sand dunes, but also gets rid of one of the sources to help create sand dunes. This makes more coastline areas at higher risk for sea level rise or flooding. Protecting beach Wrack in turn can protect biodiversity. So if you remember from the food web earlier, we see how how beach Wrack benefits shorebirds, invertebrates, and microbes. And there's even other animals that were not present in the food web that still benefit from beach Wrack. For example, squirrels or lizards can come down and eat the decomposing seaweed, and raccoons can dig through the piles for carrion. And we do have listed species at risk that are reliant on Wrack piles. This includes the western snowy plover, which is threatened, and the California leastern, which is endangered. And on the image at the right, this is the usual signage you'll find during the breeding season, and this is courtesy of California State Parks. And what we have here is the western snowy plover with some bands on. As I'm about to wrap up, here's OCH Habitat's involvement with beach Wrack. First, we have the monitoring surveys in the next slides. So each month, a volunteer or intern or a monitor would be assigned a Orange County beach segment. This could range northward to Seal Beach and southward to Trestles or San Mateo Beach. Even though we do record bird diversity and human activity, the Wrack species such as the western snowy plover on top and the California leastern on the bottom are given top priority. Features we will record include the number of adults, chicks, fledglings, and a key component is habitat description. So one of the habitat types includes the wrack line, or where most of the beach wrack will accumulate. And then we have our field trips on the next slide. This is pictures from a field trip with the Saddleback Community College Restoration Program. During the field trip, we discussed about the coastal dune habitat and ecology, and we even came across a few wrack piles. This gave us an opportunity to discuss the different types of species and how wrack contributes to the environment. On our right, we actually have seagrass, and this is one of the larger species of wrack called elkhorn kelp. If you want more information about OC habitat and along with some of our features such as bird monitoring or MPA hikes, feel free to contact us through the OCH number and website. And since I'm with UCI, we may have upcoming wrack monitoring and survey opportunities, but as soon as I get more information on that, you can feel free to contact us on the following emails. And thank you.